This is feeling really good. I love the 1911, that's no secret. It's got a smaller, slimmer grip than some of the more modern pistols. I like it better. My hands aren't all that doggone big, so it's a nice thing for me to grab, and I think that having 40 plus years of experience with it is also kind of contributing to why I like it so much. Time for some more ammo. 10mm Glock, 155 grain high velocity loads from the 10mm. This is a pretty potent combo. It'll definitely wake you up. I don't shoot a Glock all that often, but I like them. Grip's pretty big. I got to get used to that every time, and the wrist angle's a little different. It's a good shooting gun. It's a reliable gun. The magazine capacity on this is double what I have with my .45 ACP. So there's a lot of good reasons to like something like this. And the ballistics results that we got with this load and this 155 grain XTP were pretty doggone impressive. We'll take a look at those later. Hey, eventually even a Glock runs out of ammo. Guy Miner here from UltimateReloader.com. Today we're going to be getting into the .45 versus the 10mm for self-defense. Pretty cool stuff. Well, in this video we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of handguns for self-defense. We're going to be talking a little bit about the specs and the ballistics and the common loads available for both the 10 and the .45. We're going to get into our hand loading for them and how we did on that. My shooting impressions from shooting all three of these guns in 2 different cartridges and a total of 4 different loads. And we're going to talk about our cost calculator, seeing how much money we could save by hand loading. And then we're also going to talk about our results. We got some interesting chronograph results. I want to go over that along with my shooting impressions, and we'll get to some good conclusions. Handguns for self-defense is not a new concept whatsoever. Found out that China has a gun from 1288. That's the earliest known gun. So that goes back a couple of years. My oldest guns are this pair of Colts, one being a percussion model Colt way back. That's probably from the late 40s or early 50s, 1840s and 1850s. And of course it's a percussion cap, black powder only kind of a thing. That was later superseded by the single action Army Colt, this being a Bisley version of the old single action Army Colt. And that is one heck of a gun, and it was used by lawmen, it was used by the military, and it was used by civilians, ranchers, frontiersmen, all kinds of people. So moved on from that. Everything has its period, its time, and things have moved on from that and evolved into double action revolvers and semi-autos since then. When you're choosing a handgun for self-defense, there's several considerations. And the first thing to think about is how serious what it is that you're contemplating. Having a gun is not enough. You have to know how, when, and why to use it or not use it. There are many, many times you just bad advice to go use a gun for all kinds of situations. So you have to get your training. I cannot stress that enough. That is one of the very first considerations you should make, is you need to learn from somebody competent, a good firearms instructor. There are many good firearms instructors out there, and their services are not necessarily cheap, but it's one of those things where you kind of get what you pay for. And you got to look for somebody who's an actual certified firearms instructor. It will help tremendously. You'll learn the good things. You also want to know about the size of the handgun. Is concealment important to you? If you're going to be wearing this thing on a fairly regular basis, it's much easier to conceal a smaller, lighter handgun. Okay, and they're out there. Some of those are very difficult to shoot well. That's one of the compromises, because they're so small and so light. You can't get a good grip, and they kick a lot because they don't weigh much. Power versus the recoil is also another thing. Especially a lot of young guys want to go get a very powerful handgun. They got to have a 10 millimeter, or they got to have a 45, or they got to have a 44 Magnum, whatever. Okay, well, do you really, or is it just fun? Okay, it is fun, but learning how to shoot one well requires a lot more practice than a lighter recoiling pistol. So another question is semi-auto or some version of a revolver. Both have their advantages. Study hard before you put your money down and buy something. In my time as a firearms instructor, when I was a firearms instructor for over 20 years, I saw people show up with some very inappropriate handguns, people who could not handle their handguns. If they didn't have the arm strength, didn't have the hand strength, they couldn't work the slide on their semi-auto. If they didn't have the finger strength, they had trouble pulling the trigger on a double action revolver. So get a gun you can handle and that you will practice a lot with, because frankly, it takes a lot of practice to become a good handgunner. Let's get into the 45 ACP, one of my absolute favorite cartridges, and I have to admit there's a lot of nostalgia involved in that for me. When I got into the Marine Corps, it wasn't long after that that they handed me a beat-up old 1940s 1911, and I had never ever shot a 45 1911 before. I'd shot revolvers and I'd shot a couple of 22 automatics, semi-automatics, but I'd never handled a 1911 pistol before. So you get a brief class on it and then they say, go forth and qualify with this thing. Okay then, sure enough. Where did the 45 come from? 1911 owners like to say that, well, Moses gave it to us. So fair enough, John Moses Browning developed both the cartridge and the pistol, and both have evolved since then. Now his first version of it came out in 1904, 1905, and it had a 200 grain bullet at about 900 feet per second was the spec. It was inspired by the successful performance of the Colt 45 revolver. Different cartridge, big single action revolver, some double actions have been made as well, a lot of them, and it had inspired American frontiersmen, farmers, ranchers, law enforcement guys, bad guys, and the military had all used that 45 Colt with a lot of success, taking down large animals, taking down their opposition, their bad guys. It was really a very good benchmark in handgun performance, what worked well for a lot of different people. For reasons that I do not understand at all, the Army they got away from their big 45 Colt and they went to a 38 long Colt revolver. This is not a powerful cartridge whatsoever. There's a reason that almost nobody has one anymore. So yeah, they go to the 38 long Colt revolver. What do you know, we find ourselves in the Philippines and we're fighting insurrection over there, having a lot of trouble. Our guys are not able to put down the opposition even with multiple shots, and it's seen as an utter failure in combat situations. So the Army thought back and said, 45, worked for a long time, a lot of places. And so they developed the 40, they said, please give us a semi-automatic that gets close to or similar ballistics to the old 45 Colt. That's what the inspiration for the 45 semi-auto is. Completely different cartridge, and went from originally 200 grain bullet at about 900 feet per second. Military insisted on a heavier bullet, 230 grains, and of course that slowed it down to around 820, 830 feet per second. And it established a very, very successful track record with the military, used in World War I, World War II, Vietnam. Some units were still using the 45 automatic as late as the 1990s, and I think even beyond that. I'm getting a little out of touch with my particular association with the military. It's been a few years, so I'm not sure if anybody's left using the 45 these days, but I wouldn't be surprised there's somebody out there hanging on to it. It just works. Big bullets, moving slow. The 45 operates at a fairly low pressure. The standard 45 cartridge is limited to a maximum average pressure, MAP, you'll see that written down places, of 21,000 psi. There's a couple of companies out there that are making 45 plus P, which has about 100 foot per second gain over the original 230 grain ball ammo, and it can run into the mid 900s, low and mid 900s feet per second. It's only a couple of thousand PSI more, 2,000 to 3,000. It's rated at 23,000 PSI. Today's factory ammo that's available for the 45 ranges from the mild target loads at about 780 feet per second up to some pretty brisk 185 grain self-defense loads that are supposed to be doing about 1,170 feet per second. That figure might wake up a lot of people who think the 45 is always a big slow cartridge. Nope, you give it plus P and a fairly light bullet and you've got a much higher velocity piece of gear. Let's take a look at the 10. So the 10 hasn't been around nearly as long. It was introduced in the 1980s. I remember reading with interest about it in the 1980s when it came out. A company called Dornis and Dixon came out with the Bren 10, and it's often called the ill-fated Bren 10. It was not that it was a bad pistol. People couldn't get magazines. In fact, as I understand it, the Bren 10s were even shipping without magazines. That doesn't make for a very good business model, and they're gone. So other people took a look at the cartridge though. Norma was making the ammo and it was hot. 200 grain bullet at 1,200 feet per second. That is some serious stuff. And Colt said, you know, we can take our 1911 and we can chamber it for that new 10 millimeter. And they did. Colt Delta Elite. Quite a gun. Smith & Wesson came along with their version of it. Lots of other companies came along with a 10 millimeter, and it enjoyed a brief success in the late 80s after the disastrous 1986 FBI shootout in Miami, in which 2 agents were killed, several others wounded, and it was just a bloody mess. And a lot of that was attributed to using the 9 millimeter, which they didn't think was powerful enough to have solved the situation. There's a lot of other reasons that contributed to why that was such a disaster, and I'm not sure that the 9 deserves very much blame at all. However, the FBI said, we need a more powerful gun. Instead of just reaching back and getting a 45 ACP, which I thought was a decent option, they said, no, we want the 10. And so they went with a 10 millimeter. Smith & Wesson came up with a wonderful gun for them, and it marched on and became a very brief-lived episode in American law enforcement where the 10 was popular. Why brief? Recoil. It was difficult to train your average cop to shoot the semi-auto 10 millimeter well. It took a lot of training time, a lot of expensive ammunition, and in fact, so much so that the FBI went to the ammo manufacturer and said, hey, can you water this thing down a bit? And they took it down to about 1,000 feet per second with a 180. Of course, the ammo manufacturers said, we can do that. We can do that in a smaller, shorter case, and that's where the 40 comes from. 40 Smith & Wesson, which is the subject of another video coming up. But, so the 10 has been in law enforcement for very few years. There's some agencies kept them on for a long time. You know, why retire a good gun? But it's a difficult cartridge for the average cop to handle. And so it just sort of went out of style. This thing is loaded to a maximum average pressure of 37.5. Imagine that against 21,000 for the 45 ACP. They operate at 2 very different pressure levels, close to double what the 45 ACP is at. So that's something to consider, and that's another reason why it is such an intense cartridge. Colonel Jeff Cooper, you may have heard of him. He was an early fan of the 10 millimeter. He liked it. He was a big advocate for it. It performed really well. He liked the power. He liked that it was fairly compact. I mean, it's no longer than a 45 ACP, so it fits in the same size of gun frame. And I think he's a big reason why it became popular among a lot of handgunners, because he wrote some very good things about it, had some good experiences, and passed that on to us. In recent years, the 10 has had a resurgence in popularity as a bear defense gun, defense against large, aggressive wildlife. It's seen by many people as a reasonable alternative to a big Magnum revolver. Possibly. We actually did a video on that a couple years ago. Let's take a look at these head-to-head, 45 versus the 10. 45 has that velocity range of about 780 to 1170. The 10 is up much higher at 1150 to about 1410, and there's some loads that are much faster. Talked about the pressure level already being almost twice in that 10 millimeter over the 45's pretty low pressure round. 45 has a big diameter, 0.451 inches, and the 10 is right there at 40 caliber. So the 45 has a bigger diameter. That's interesting. That was a pretty old school thought, but it worked for a long time. And the energy on them, well, we'll take a look at that in more detail, but the 45 gets kind of shut down by the 10 in the energy department. Factory ballistics. Our factory ballistics here, I chose to use a light and a heavy bullet weight for each of these two cartridges. And the 10 millimeter I went with a 155 and the 200. There is a very popular 180, but I said, well, if we're going to get a big heavy bullet, let's just go with a 200. And so that's what we loaded, 155 and 200. And for the 45 ACP, we loaded the 185, which is pretty popular, and the traditional 230 grain load. Did both of those. Worth noting here and taking a look at are the energy figures. The velocity figures are interesting, but the energy figures are very telling. They tell you the story there that the 10 makes a lot more power than the 45. Look at that, 684 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. And that shows in quite a difference with the 45 ACP, especially there's a rather mild 185 grain load in there, very popular because it doesn't recoil much. It's still an effective 45 self-defense load, and it has only 970 feet per second, developing about 386 foot-pounds of energy. So we've got 600s for the 10, and we've got 300s and 400s for the 45. If we punch it out there 50 yards and take a look at what that is, that's a long shot with a handgun, a self-defense situation, by the way. We've got 500 and some odd foot-pounds for the 10, and we're down into the 3s and 4s for the 45. The farther the distance, the more advantage the 10 seems to have. I took a look. These are just selected pretty randomly. I took a look at all the major manufacturers to see what they offered in the way of self-defense loads for these two cartridges. And I was impressed. I expected the 45 to have a lot. I carried a 45 1911 through my whole law enforcement career, and I was really impressed. I knew there was a lot of stuff out there for it, from 185 grain loads, 200 grain loads, 230 grain loads. Now there's 220s, and there's a lot of other choices out there. It's been around for over 100 years, about 120 years now that the 45 has been available, and so there's been a lot of research done, and a lot of different loads have been come up with. And that's good. It gives you a broad choice of things. The 10 millimeter really surprised me. It's only been around since the 80s, and it's been kind of popular for a while, not very popular for a while. It seems to be on the rise again. Seems to be a lot more people carrying 10s, and there's a good selection of the of ammo for it from the factory. 155, 180, 200 grains, 175s. It seems like every major manufacturer makes at least one or two, if not more, versions of self-defense loads for the 10 millimeter. I was impressed. Ammo expense. These big handguns eat expensive ammo. And the training stuff, the full metal jacket and all, is a pretty doggone good bargain. But if you're going to be shooting the self-defense loads from the factory, premium type ammo, and it doesn't really matter which one it's from, which manufacturer it's from, they're expensive. I was taking a look at that, and I was seeing with the 10 about a little over $1 up to about $1.25 per round. And with the 45, a little bit more, about $1.10 up to about $1.30 per round. And that's problematic for your shooting, right? Because that explains why they sell the self-defense stuff in these little boxes of 20, because it hurts to buy 40 or 50 of them. But 20 of them, yeah, okay, I can do that. I can buy that. not a problem. This is not, that kind of factory ammo is not real appealing for people to go shoot a lot of, go shoot 300 of a day. No, not with that expensive ammo. So how can we beat that? Well, we can buy bulk, of course, bulk ball metal jacket training ammo, or we're hand loaders here, and we can hand load our own ammo. That is a huge cost saving. I figured out that both of these cost very similar for me to hand load, around 75 cents a load using brand new brass and figuring the cost of the brass in there. If I take out the brass, then I'm only looking around 50 cents a load. The big expense on these is these expensive self-defense oriented hollow point bullets. They are not cheap. On the other hand, we're talking about self-defense. You're thinking about protecting your life and the lives of others, you really ought to have good ammo. It's well worth noting that the use of hand loads for self-defense is very controversial. There's a whole group of people that are convinced that if you use hand loads in your self-defense, and God forbid you have to shoot somebody, that the legal ramifications are going to be much worse for you than if you used factory loads. That's a consideration. Whether that's actually true or not has been debated back and forth, and I don't know the answer. I do know that I tend to carry factory ammunition for my own self-defense purposes. Did that as a cop all the way through, and I still do so. Not that you can't make very good self-defense oriented hand loads, but it is controversial, and I urge you to do your research and make up your mind on that. Don't just walk blindly into it and then realize, oops, I made a mistake. So let's take a look at our loads, what we came up with here at Ultimate Reloader. And in the 10 millimeter, I mentioned we came up with both 155 and the 200 grain ammunition for it. And I used a powder that I've used before only in 44 Magnum and 500 Smith & Wesson, and I may have used it in some 357 Magnum loads. I know I used it in the 44 and the 500 with very good results. And I was surprised when I took a look at my Hodgdon data and said, oh, this is highly recommended. Hodgdon, of course, distributes both accurate and our Ramshot powders now. So that makes a really broad selection of powders available from Hodgdon, which is nice. So I took a look at that accurate number 9, and I worked my way up and had some max level loads here for the 200 grain and the 155. I would not advise going over these loads, and they are stout. And I found them both available on the Hodgdon's online reloading data center. Very good site, very easy to use. They have both they have the 10 millimeter, they have the 45, and they have the 45 plus P. Somebody may be wondering why there's not a 10 millimeter plus P. It's already plus P, all right? Plus P just means more power, higher pressure. And the 10 already operates at very high pressure, so it doesn't need any more. The 45, it could use a little boost. And so it got that, and that I didn't find that data in the annual manual, the printed manual here, but I did find it in their online, that 45 plus P. Anyway, the number 9 is a very fine grained powder, and it flows very, very nicely through a manual powder measure, just pouring them on out. Very little variation from shot to shot. Nice figures that we got, and we'll get into that. And just a really good powder with high performance and tight numbers. For the 45, I had never used Ramshot Silhouette before. I normally stick with some other powders, oftentimes a faster burning powder. So I tried the Silhouette, and I found out that it too meters really well. So both of these powders go through a powder measure so nicely, and that means they'd be handy to use in some sort of a progressive press. I was using it on the good old turret press, no problem. But if you're loading off a progressive because you're going to be making lots of ammo, well, you know what? Both of those powders would work out really well. Ramshot Silhouette and the accurate number 9. Used good old CCI large pistol primers for all of them. Primed on a Frankfurt Arsenal tool. It's become a favorite of mine. I don't seem to use much else anymore, but it's a good one. And I just can't I don't know, very, very happy with these. It's not that I can't say enough about them, I can, but they are good, solid powder choices for these two cartridges. Let's talk about the pistols. Having any trouble telling these two apart, these two Glocks apart? Me too. When I was shooting them both at the range, I was very careful to keep them separate. This one's a 45, Glock Model 21. This one's a 10 millimeter, Glock Model 20. Externally, they're virtually identical. They both have 4.6-inch barrels. They both weigh right around 30 ounces. One's at 30, one's at 29, and that's unloaded with the magazines in them. Believe me, they pick up some weight when you fill up those magazines. The Glock 20 can hold 15 rounds in that magazine. It may be difficult to get that last one or two in there. Glocks are notorious for that, but 15 rounds and plus one if you keep one in the chamber, which I do. So you've got 16 rounds on tap in that gun, and they're powerful rounds. No wonder it's such an attractive package for a lot of outdoorsmen, a lot of cowboy types, a lot of guides, a lot of fly fishermen, people who go places to hike, to camp, to fish, to hunt. A lot of times they'll choose a Glock 20 in 10 millimeter for their gun because it has the adequate power, and yet you've got a lot of rounds of ammo, which is really good. Having more ammo is better than having less ammo. The Glock 21, that was one of the guns that my department and many other police departments have issued over the years. The only complaint I've ever heard about the Glock 21 is that the grip is big, and that is on the 20 and the 21. Well, if you can hold that, you're good. And I've seen people with pretty small hands adapt to using the Glock 21 and to firing it well. I've got kind of medium-sized hands myself. I don't have any problem with it. I prefer the slimmer grip of the 1911, but that could be mostly because I've had a lot more experience with 1911. Started in on it over 40 years ago. So yeah, now we take a look at the Kimber 1911. And it weighs a little bit more, comes in at 39 ounces. It's got a 5-inch barrel instead of a 4.6-inch barrel, and it holds 8 rounds in the magazine. I remember being excited when the 8-rounders came out instead of just 7, and it was like, whoa, I get a whole nother bullet. And I was really happy about that. And then the big Glocks came out, and I said, wow, 13 rounds in that Model 21 and 15 rounds in the Model 20? Dang. That's an advantage. It's no wonder to me that a lot of people choose the lighter weight, pretty much weatherproof, high capacity Glocks. They are an excellent choice for an outdoorsman or for self-defense. Chronograph results. We took these out and we shot them past our chronograph, and we got some interesting numbers. The first one up that I shot was the 155 grain from the 10 millimeter. And I just thought, okay, it's the lightest bullet that I've got in this whole test. I'll start there. And it also had the most ferocious recoil and the highest velocity, which the recoil thing surprised me a little bit, but the velocity did not. Almost 1,350 feet per second. And if you take a look here at our SD and ES figures, you'll see some really tight numbers. That is a compliment to the powder, how well that powder works with the 10 millimeter. SD numbers of 15 for the light bullet load and 8 for the 200 grain load. 8 feet per second? Wow, that's like what we get out of some of our match rifles. And in this case, we're doing it with a Glock pistol. I was indeed impressed. Take a look at the 45 ACP. Our SD and ES numbers are a little bit bigger. They're more in line with what I expected, and I will note that the Kimber, for whatever reason, showed us a very tight SD of 12. I don't know, maybe, who knows what the reason for that is. It's a good gun, there's no doubt about it. And just a smidge higher velocity out of the Kimber as opposed to the 4.6-inch Glock 21. 4.6 inches versus 5 inches. Okay, just going to get a little bit of velocity increase, especially with the big 230 grain bullets. They just don't pick up a lot from that extra 4/10 of an inch. Our energy figures are also very, very interesting. 626 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle for the 10 millimeter Glock. Wow, That's that 155 grain bullet, and that means you're hitting your target hard. And that energy sustains downrange a bit with this too. It's a very effective gun out to 50 yards, no problem, and probably well beyond that. 200 grainer doesn't develop quite as much energy. That's okay. 568 is a very, very respectable figure, and it's got the mass of that big 200 grain bullet going for it too. The 185 and 230 grain loads from our Glock came in there at 502 and then 440 for the energy figures, and just barely a tiny bit higher with the 5-inch. You're not going to see a lot of difference between a 4.6 and a 5-inch barrel when it comes to velocity and energy. I put the power factor in there because people have asked me before about major and minor power factors. That's a thing used in competition for the most part, and they try to keep those separate, so if your gun kicks a lot, you don't have to compete against the guys who have something that doesn't kick much, and that's a really good way. These are all pretty tight. We're looking at the low 200s for all of them, with the king of that probably being the 200 grain 10 millimeter. That's got a pretty good figure there at 226. And that's a big power figure, and yeah, you pay for it with the recoil, there's no doubt about it. But that's all comfortably in the major power class, which, as I recall, starts at 165. Things below 165 are minor, things above 165 are major. I might be off just a little bit on that. Got done with our shooting at the range. That was fun. I really like shooting, period. I like shooting self-defense type scenarios and drills, and I like shooting big, powerful handguns. Always have. It's just plain fun. It's also very, very productive. If you're going to have a gun for self-defense, you got to be good with it. I am nowhere near as fast as I used to be when I was both younger and training more. And honestly, I think that training more has more to do with that than getting older. I don't train as much, and it showed while I'm doing those drills. But these are undeniably the heavy hitters of the self-defense gun world. There's no doubt about the 10 millimeter especially, and the 45 has that long, long history going back as a man-stopper. There is a recoil penalty to be paid, particularly with the 10 and particularly with these max loads that we put through it. It's going to go ahead and beat you up a little bit. It's also a gun that requires more practice, refine your technique, get your grip strength down, get your recovery time, your follow-up stuff much, much better. It's going to be tougher to do all those things well, but you can do it. It just takes more effort. My impression between the Glock and the 1911 in 45 was that the 230 grain loads had more controllable recoil than my very, very warm 185 grain loads. More controllable recoil. The Glock tended to spread out the impact in my palm of my hand. It's got a much wider grip than the 1911. The 1911 kind of focused it in there. On the other hand, I could get a better grip with a slimmer grip, single stack magazine on the 1911, and also many, many years of shooting 1911s. It just feels like part of me. When I go ahead and draw that gun and point it in, it's very natural to me anymore. So that's probably my own personal bias on that. But yeah, both of them were quite controllable, not a problem. Let's talk about some pros and cons. Head-to-head results here between these two. 10 millimeter, obviously more powerful and outperforms the old 45. No doubt about it. Much as I love the 45, the 10 is definitely more powerful. Higher velocity and more pressure, and it just rocks. I like that thing. It is proven to be more suitable for defense against large and dangerous wildlife. Some of the videos coming out of Alaska and some of the people I've talked to, and the success that they've had with their Glocks on grizzly bear, Alaskan brown bear, those things are very, very big. I only hunted them with a rifle, and yeah, and I want a big, powerful rifle. So there we go. They also have taken down moose, which the Alaskan moose is a huge beast and can get very, very aggressive too, both male and female. In fact, I've heard that the female moose can be especially vicious when they get angry. And it's not going to go well shooting one with a gun that isn't powerful enough to do the job. A lot of people look at the 10 millimeter as a suitable replacement or an alternative to the Magnum revolvers. Your typical 44 Magnum revolver is a rather large, heavy thing with a lot of recoil. I happen to love 44 Magnum revolvers, but I will admit that a 10 millimeter in either 1911 or the Glock 20 or any one of a number of other guns out there is a very, very viable alternative. Now, if you want power, yeah, go with a big heavy revolver. But the semi-autos are easier to carry, and they offer a lot of advantages if you don't need the ultimate power there. The 10s are more difficult to master than the 45 or probably most other semi-automatic handguns. They just kick more. They have more muzzle blast. They are a more ferocious thing to try and control. You've got to work on your form, you've got to work on your follow through, you've got to work on your grip strength, and then you can actually master these things. There are some environmental considerations. If you live out in the country, rural area, wide open spaces, longer shots being more possible, and the chances of having an adverse encounter with wildlife, cougar, bear, moose, whatever, then I think the 10 makes an awful lot of sense. In town, it's got some limitations. It has a potential of carrying a lot of energy farther down range and having very good penetration way down there. So when rounds get cranked off in town, then you may be endangering more people. Go through house walls and things like that. You have to remember that the use by law enforcement of the 10 millimeter was rather short-lived. It was real popular for a very few years, and then that faded off, and it's pretty much gone from law enforcement anymore, replaced by the 40, and now the 40 is actually fading away and being replaced by the 9. Fair enough, and there's still people out there using the 45. It's kind of nice. So the 45, it has a long-standing history of use with military to start with, and then civilian owners and law enforcement got a hold of it, and they all liked it. So it's still in use with all those things. Again, I'm not sure that there's military units still using it, but there's very much law enforcement and civilian owners using the darn thing. 45 just keeps on performing. It's a little more controllable, quite a bit more controllable, I think, than the 10. That was one of the reasons I shot both the 21 and the 20 when we were at the range, because, well, they're the same pistol virtually. They feel about the same in hand until you pull the trigger. And then it goes bang, and one of them recoils a lot more than the other. The 45 seems to be more controllable to me, and it also may give you a little bit less penetration, which you think, oh, less penetration. Well, less penetration in a self-defense thing can be good. If you're shooting Mr. Bad Guy, you don't necessarily want that bullet to either exit, or if it does exit, you'd like for it to have lost and shed a lot of its energy, using up most of its energy on Mr. Bad Guy. So then it's less dangerous to whatever is behind the assailant, Mr. Bad Guy, whether it's people, property, or whatever. You've lost some of that energy, and it's not going to be as dangerous as it might have been. So we've looked hard at both cartridges. We've looked at the 45, we've looked at the 10, we've run them in a couple different platforms here, the 1911 and the Glock, and it's time to come to some conclusions, because we have to make up our minds after. It's time to take a look at where we're going to go with all this information that we've brought in and that we've shared with you so far. These are indeed hard-hitting defensive handgun cartridges. There is no monkeying around with these things. They get down to business. They are powerful, and they will do the job. They've been doing the job for a long time. Both are very well proven. They both have an advantage over smaller, weaker cartridges. They hit harder, they inflict more damage, and they have an advantage because of that. Now, the drawback to that harder hitting is dealing with more recoil, and particularly in the case of the 10, more muzzle blast, which can be a little bit disconcerting for the shooter whoever's using that gun. You think about it, especially in something like a low light situation and indoors, where a lot of shootings happen indoors and in low light. There's going to be a big muzzle blast to deal with and a bright flash, and that's a problem. And the more intense your cartridge is, the more intense that blast is to deal with. Ammunition, training ammunition and self-defense ammunition is more expensive with the 10 and the 45 than it is with, say, the 9mm. That's one of the reasons a lot of people like the 9, is it's much less expensive to feed. So there you go, in addition to having lower recoil. How to choose between the two? The 10 seems particularly well suited for use in rural areas where things are more spread out. You've got the possibility of making a longer shot, and you've got a stronger possibility of having to deal with a large, aggressive, wild animal of some sort. That's where it shines, is when it might need to reach out a little bit farther, or you're dealing with something bigger that takes more stopping power. The 45 tends to shine at shorter ranges. It tends to shine in urban areas a lot, where your shots may be very, very close, and you just need a big bullet to go in and do what big bullets do. The 45 also may have less penetration. Now I say that may because I think that depends more on bullet choice than on the particular cartridge. Both of them can penetrate a lot, particularly if you're using full metal jacket ammunition. Full metal jacket ammunition is thought of really as having less stopping power and more penetration, and that's something to be very aware of. And that's why police agencies all over the place use hollow points. They get that stopping power, and it also helps limit the penetration, which is a really, really handy thing. I've investigated some shootings. We've had some shootings here in our local police department, in our local area, the county sheriffs and all, and you really have to be careful with the penetration that your handgun does. Not necessarily all your shots are going to hit. Some of them are going to go zooming off out there somewhere. Every shot has to be accounted for. So you want to have enough power to do the job, but you don't want to endanger everybody down the block either. I'm a fan of the 45 ACP. There's a certain familiarity and fondness for the cartridge that I have. I know how to load for it. I know what I like to, what results I like to get from it. And so I'm probably going to go ahead and stick, for the most part, with my 45 as my self-defense cartridge. However, I have to admit that I really like the 10. I have a soft spot in my heart for it, and a 10mm in either a double stack platform like the Glock or a single stack magazine like the 1911 would be a wonderful thing for me. I spend a lot of time in the great outdoors, and it's entirely possible that I'll find myself with a 10mm for that purpose someday. What I want to know is, do you favor one over the other? Do you have experience with one or both of these cartridges, the 45 or the 10? Tell us about it. Drop a comment and we'll have a discussion. That means it's time to wrap up this video.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, we're on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, where we've got unrestricted content, and Instagram. Make sure to follow us on all those channels. Ultimate Reloader also has a commercial solutions division serving law enforcement, the military, and the gun industry. We have some unique capabilities, including a comprehensive suite of recoil testing and evaluation capabilities, trigger profiling, and more. If you're interested in custom rifles like what we build here on the channel, or gunsmithing services, you're going to want to go to rifles.ultimatereloader.com and get on the wait list. If you want to learn lucrative gunsmithing like what I show here on the channel, including building custom rifles and Cerakote plus a whole bunch more, you're going to want to check out the Colorado School of Trades, schooloftrades.edu. Thanks again for watching.